They said love died when duty called. They said a duke never looked back. But on a winter night that turned England's breath to ice, Arthur Worthington, the untouchable Duke of Ashbourne, found the one woman he'd loved in silence for years. Abandoned, freezing and utterly broken. What he did next shattered every rule of honor, title and blood. This is not a story of right choices. This is a story of impossible ones. If you love epic historical romance, subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. Let's begin. The winter of 1814 came to England like a punishment. Snow fell in sheets so thick that carriages couldn't move, and lanterns became useless against the white wall of the storm. The roads between London and the countryside disappeared beneath ice, and the great estates, those towering symbols of power and lineage, became islands, cut off from one another by cold and silence. Arthur Worthington, Duke of Ashbourne, had been riding for hours. His coat was soaked through, his gloves stiff with frost. His horse's breath came out in jagged clouds, and still he pushed forward. The servants at Ashbourne Hall had begged him not to leave. "Your Grace, the storm has its madness." But Arthur hadn't listened. He never did when it came to her. Rose. Her name was a thorn lodged deep in his chest, one he'd learned to live with but never remove. He hadn't seen her in 2 years. Not since the day she'd stood in the garden at Hawthorne Manor, her hands trembling as she told him she was to be married. Not since the moment she'd looked at him with those wide, desperate eyes and whispered, "I have no choice, Arthur. Please understand." He had understood, and he had let her go. The wind howled, tearing at Arthur's face with claws of ice. His horse stumbled, hooves slipping on the frozen ground, but Arthur urged him forward. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not when every instinct in his body screamed that something was desperately, terribly wrong. The letter had arrived 3 hours ago. Crumpled, anonymous, desperate. "She is gone. They will not search. If you ever cared, come now." Arthur had known immediately who it was from. One of the housemaids at Greymore Estate, perhaps. Someone who'd seen Rose's misery and couldn't bear the silence anymore. He'd mounted his horse within minutes. Now as the storm raged and the world turned to nothing but white and cold and darkness, Arthur found his mind drifting to places he'd forbidden it to go. He remembered the wedding. God, he remembered every excruciating detail. The way Rose had walked down the aisle in ivory silk, her face pale as death. The way her hand had shaken when Greymore placed the ring on her finger. The way she'd glanced toward the back of the church, just once, just for a heartbeat, and her eyes had found Arthur's. And the look in them. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Arthur had smiled. He'd raised his glass at the reception. He'd congratulated the groom with perfect composure, and then he'd gone home, locked himself in his study, and proceeded to get so drunk he couldn't remember his own name. That had been 2 years ago. 2 years of telling himself it was over. That he'd done the right thing. That letting her marry Greymore, a man with wealth and title and connections, had been the honorable choice. 2 years of lying to himself. The horse stumbled again, jerking Arthur back to the present. He blinked hard, forcing his mind to focus. The cold was brutal now, seeping through every layer of clothing, turning his fingers numb inside his gloves. And then he saw it. A shape, dark against the white. Arthur's heart stopped. He dismounted before his mind could catch up with his body, his boots sinking into snow up to his knees. The cold bit through his coat, through his skin, straight into his bones. But he didn't feel it. Not yet. Because there, slumped against the trunk of a barren oak tree, was Rose. Her cloak was torn. Her hair, once always pinned in perfect curls, hung in wet, tangled strands around her face. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death. She wasn't moving. "No," Arthur breathed. "No, no, no." He dropped to his knees beside her, snow soaking through his breeches. His hands reached for her, shaking, not from the cold, but from something far worse. Fear. The kind that lived in the space between breath and silence. He touched her face. Ice cold. Her eyes were closed, lashes dusted with snow. Her chest, he couldn't tell if it was rising. "Rose." His voice cracked. He pulled off his gloves with his teeth and pressed his bare hand to her cheek. "Rose, please. Look at me." Nothing. Panic clawed up his throat. Arthur's hands moved to her shoulders, shaking her gently at first, then harder. "Rose, wake up, please." Still nothing. His breath came in harsh gasps now, clouds of white in the frozen air. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat just below her jaw, searching desperately for a pulse. For a terrible, endless moment he felt nothing. Then, there. Faint, thread thin. Barely there, but there. Relief hit him like a fist to the chest, followed immediately by terror. She was alive, but barely. And if he didn't get her warm, if he didn't act now, she wouldn't be for long. Arthur stood, lifting her with him. She weighed nothing in his arms, fragile in a way that made his stomach twist. He'd always thought of Rose as strong, stubborn even, a woman who could hold her own in any room, who could smile through a storm. But this broken, frozen version of her was something else entirely. He carried her to his horse. The animal shifted, uneasy in the storm, but held steady as Arthur draped Rose across the saddle. He climbed up behind her, pulling her body against his chest, wrapping his coat around her as best he could. "Stay with me," he murmured into her hair, his voice low and rough. "Just stay with me, Rose. Don't you dare leave. Not like this. Not when I just found you." He turned the horse back the way he'd come. The storm screamed around them. The wind tore at his face, his hands, his resolve. But Arthur didn't stop. He pressed his heels into the horse's flanks and rode into the white void, holding Rose as if letting go would mean losing her forever. And perhaps it would. The cottage appeared like a ghost through the snow. Arthur had nearly missed it, a small, crumbling structure half buried in drifts, its chimney dark and its windows shuttered. It was a shepherd's hut, abandoned for the season, forgotten by everyone except those who knew the land well enough to find it. Arthur knew. He dismounted carefully, keeping Rose in his arms, and kicked the door open. The interior was dark, cold, but it was shelter. That was all that mattered. He laid her down on the rough wooden floor, near the remnant of a stone hearth. His hands moved on instinct, stripping off his soaked coat, pulling firewood from a stack by the wall, striking flint until sparks caught and flames began to lick at the kindling. The fire grew. Light and heat slowly filled the small space. Arthur turned back to Rose. She still hadn't moved. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible. Her dress clung to her body, wet and heavy, draining what little warmth she had left. Arthur's throat tightened. He knew what had to be done. He also knew what it would mean. Rose was not his wife. She was the Countess of Greymore. She belonged to another man, a man who, by all appearances, had let her walk out into a winter storm and hadn't bothered to follow. But Arthur wasn't thinking about rules. Not anymore. He knelt beside her and began to unlace her cloak. His fingers fumbled with the ties, clumsy from cold and adrenaline. The fabric peeled away, heavy with ice. Beneath it, her dress was just as soaked. Arthur hesitated. His hands hovered over the buttons at her back. This was a line, one he'd spent years refusing to cross. But if he didn't cross it now, she would die. His hands trembled as he reached for the laces of her dress, not from cold, from something far more dangerous, the knowledge that this was sacred ground, that he was crossing a threshold he could never uncross. Arthur had imagined touching Rose 1,000 times. In stolen moments at balls when she'd laughed at something across the room and he'd memorized the sound. In dreams that left him aching and ashamed when he woke. But never like this. Never with her body limp and lifeless, her skin ice-cold beneath his fingertips. "Forgive me," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. Each button he unfastened felt like a prayer. Each layer he removed, an act of worship. He worked carefully, methodically, keeping his gaze fixed not on her body but on the task itself. The sodden gown, the petticoat that clung to her like a second skin, the stays that had to be unlaced with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. When he finally removed the last layer, leaving her in nothing but her thin chemise, Arthur grabbed a rough wool blanket from a shelf and wrapped it around her with a reverence that bordered on religious. He pulled her closer to the fire, positioning her so the heat would reach her without burning. Then he removed his own wet shirt and laid it near the flames to dry. He sat back against the wall, breathing hard, his hands still shaking. And he waited. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Arthur lost track. He fed the fire. He rubbed warmth into her hands, her arms, willing life back into her limbs. He spoke to her, Low, steady words that had no meaning except to fill the silence. "You're safe now. I've got you. You're going to be all right." He didn't know if he believed it, but he said it anyway, over and over, like a vow. It was near dawn when Rose finally stirred. A soft sound, almost a whimper, escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitched. Arthur leaned forward, his heart hammering. "Rose?" Her eyes opened, slowly, painfully. They were unfocused at first, clouded with confusion. Then they found his face, and she went completely still. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the wind still howled outside, but inside the cottage there was only silence and the weight of 2 years of unspoken words. Rose's lips parted. "Arthur!" Her voice was barely a whisper, broken, disbelieving. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Her gaze moved over him, his wet hair, his bare chest beneath his coat, his expression raw in a way she'd never seen before. Then her eyes dropped to herself. The blanket, the firelight, the realization of where she was and what had happened. Tears welled in her eyes. "You came," she whispered. Arthur's jaw tightened. His hand, still resting on her arm, squeezed gently. "I'll always come," he said. And in that moment, with the storm still raging and the world outside frozen and unforgiving, something between them shifted. A line was crossed. A vow was made, not with words, but with the look in his eyes and the way her hand reached up, trembling, hesitant, to touch his face. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. Arthur shook his head. His voice was steady, final. "Not while I'm breathing." Dawn came slowly, reluctant to break through the thick veil of snow that still blanketed the world outside the cottage. The storm had quieted to a whisper, but the cold remained, sharp, biting, unforgiving. Inside, the fire had burned low. Arthur hadn't slept. He'd sat against the wall opposite Rose, watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity. She drifted in and out of consciousness through the night, murmuring half-formed words he couldn't quite catch, her body still fighting off the cold that had nearly claimed her. Now, as pale light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, she stirred again. This time, her eyes opened fully. Arthur straightened. Rose blinked, disoriented, her gaze sweeping the unfamiliar space before landing on him. Recognition flickered, then memory. Her expression shifted, first relief, then something darker. Shame. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and sat up slowly, wincing as her muscles protested. "How long?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. "Since last night," Arthur said quietly. You were nearly gone when I found you." Rose closed her eyes. A tremor ran through her, not from cold this time, but from something deeper. She pressed her fingertips to her temples as if trying to piece together fragments she'd rather forget. "I walked," she whispered. I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care." Arthur's chest tightened. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to demand answers, to know what had driven her out into a storm that could have killed her, to know what had happened in the 2 years since he'd last seen her. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he stood and moved to the fire, adding more wood, coaxing the flames back to life. The warmth spread slowly, filling the small space. "You need to eat," he said, his tone practical, controlled. "And drink something warm." Rose didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze distant, fixed on something he couldn't see. Arthur had little to offer. Dried meat from his saddlebag, a flask of whiskey he'd packed for the cold. He handed her the flask first. She took it with shaking hands and drank, coughing as the liquid burned down her throat. "Slowly," Arthur said, crouching beside her. She met his eyes then. Really met them. And for the first time since she'd woken, he saw her. The Rose he remembered. The woman who'd laughed in gardens and debated politics at dinner parties, who'd once looked at him like he was the only person in the room. But there was something else now. Something broken. "Why did you come?" she asked softly. Arthur's jaw tightened. "You know why." "Arthur, don't." His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. "Don't tell me I shouldn't have. Don't tell me it was foolish or improper or any of the things you're about to say." Rose's breath hitched. Tears pooled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I wasn't going to," she whispered. "I was going to say, thank you." The words hung between them, fragile and heavy all at once. Arthur looked away. They didn't speak much after that. Arthur gave her his dry shirt to wear beneath the blanket. She turned her back while she changed, and he did the same, busying himself with checking the state of the storm outside. The snow had stopped, but the world was still buried. It would be hours, maybe a full day, so before the roads were passable again. They were trapped here, together. The thought should have felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like something else, entirely. Something neither of them dared name. When Rose was dressed, she moved closer to the fire, sitting with her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around herself. Arthur sat across from her, the flames casting shadows across his face. Silence stretched between them for a long moment. Then Rose spoke. "He doesn't know I'm gone." Arthur's gaze snapped to her. "My husband," she clarified, her voice hollow. "Lord Greymore. He left for London 3 days ago. He won't be back for a fortnight. The servants, they wouldn't dare send word. They're too afraid of him." Arthur's hands curled into fists. "And that's why you left?" It wasn't a question. Rose didn't answer immediately. She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. "There was a night," she began finally, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. "About a month ago. He came home from London. I was waiting for him in the drawing room. I'd prepared his favorite dinner. I thought perhaps if I tried harder, if I was more agreeable, he might—" Her voice broke. She swallowed hard. "He walked past me as if I weren't there. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge I existed. He simply poured himself a drink, took it to his study and locked the door." Arthur's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "I stood there for an hour," Rose continued, "waiting, hoping he'd come out, that he'd say something, anything. But he didn't, and I realized—" She paused, her hands tightening around her knees. "I'd become invisible. Not just to him, to myself. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. She was hollow, a ghost wearing my face." Arthur felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. "That's when I knew," Rose whispered, "that if I stayed I would disappear completely, and no one would even notice." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur wanted to cross the space between them. He wanted to pull her into his arms and promise her that he saw her, that he'd always seen her, that she was the furthest thing from invisible. But he stayed where he was. Because touching her now, says when she was this raw, this broken, felt like taking advantage of her pain. "Rose," he said quietly, "what did he do to you?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter." "It does." "Arthur, tell me." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes. The part of her that wanted to protect him from the truth versus the part that was so tired of carrying it alone. Finally, she spoke. "He never hit me," she said carefully. "Never raised his hand. But there are other ways to break someone, Arthur. Quiet ways, ways that leave no marks." Arthur's throat tightened. "He would go days without speaking to me," Rose continued, her voice gaining strength. "Weeks, sometimes. I would sit across from him at dinner, and he would read his papers as if I weren't there. When I tried to speak, he would sigh, this heavy, irritated sound, as if my voice itself was an inconvenience." Her hands trembled. Arthur watched her fingers twist together, knuckles white. "And the worst part," she said, "the worst part was that I started to believe him, that I was an inconvenience, a burden, something to be tolerated rather than loved. I stopped speaking unless spoken to, stopped laughing, stopped existing." A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. "I don't know who I am anymore, Arthur," she whispered. "I don't know if there's anything left of me to save." That did it. Arthur crossed the space between them in 2 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "You listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not invisible. You are not a burden. You are not broken beyond repair. You are Rose, the woman who once told the Duke of Wellington his military strategies were pedestrian at best. The woman who smuggled an entire litter of kittens into a garden party because the groundskeeper was going to drown them. The woman who made me believe in something other than duty and obligation. Rose's breath hitched. You are still in there, Arthur continued fiercely, and I will spend every day for the rest of my life reminding you of that if I have to. The tears came in earnest now, streaming down her face. Arthur wiped them away with his thumbs, his own eyes burning. I see you, Rose, he whispered. I have always seen you. And then she broke. She fell forward into his arms, sobbing against his chest with a grief that sounded like it had been building for 2 years. Arthur held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist. He didn't tell her to stop, didn't try to quiet her. He just held her and let her shatter, because sometimes breaking was the only way to start healing. When the sobs finally subsided, Rose pulled back slightly, her face blotchy and wet. I'm sorry, she said, her voice thick. Don't be. I'm such a mess. You're perfect. She laughed, a watery, broken sound. You're a terrible liar. Arthur's lips curved into the faintest smile. I'm not lying. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she asked the question they'd both been avoiding. What do we do now? Arthur's expression sobered. He sat back on his heels, his hand still resting on her arms. That depends, he said. On what? On what you want. His gaze was steady. If you want to go back to Greymore, I will take you. I won't like it, but I will do it. Or, he paused. Or, Rose prompted, or you come with me and you never go back. Rose's eyes widened. Arthur, that's insane, he finished. Scandalous, socially ruinous, I know. You would lose everything. I know that too. Then why? Arthur's jaw tightened. His voice, when he spoke, was absolute. Because I'd rather see you ruined and free than safe and dead inside. Rose stared at him, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. If I leave him, she began. You'll be ruined, Arthur said. Socially, financially. Your family will disown you, society will shun you, and I... He paused. I won't be able to protect you from all of it. But I will try. For the rest of my life, I will try. Rose's hand came up to cover her mouth. Fresh tears spilled over. You mean it, she whispered. Every word. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Arthur thought she might refuse, thought she might choose the safety of her cage over the uncertainty of freedom. But then she opened her eyes and looked at him with something he hadn't seen there in 2 years. Hope. Then take me away from here, she said. Please, before I lose my courage. Arthur's relief was so profound it made him dizzy. You won't lose it, he said. I won't let you. He pulled her into his arms again, and this time she didn't cry, she just held on. The hours passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Outside, the world remained frozen. Inside, the fire crackled, and 2 people who had spent years pretending not to love each other sat in the warmth of a truth they could no longer deny. Rose had stopped crying. She sat with her back against the rough stone wall, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the flames. Arthur remained nearby, giving her space, but staying close enough that she could reach for him if she needed to. I used to imagine this, Rose said softly after a long silence. Arthur's brow furrowed. Imagine what? Being alone with you. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Not like this, not in a frozen cottage in the middle of nowhere, but somewhere quiet, somewhere no one could find us, somewhere we could just be. Arthur's throat tightened. He'd imagined it too. More times than he could count. In ballrooms when he'd watch her dance with other men and pretend his heart wasn't breaking. In his study late at night when the house was silent and he was drowning in brandy and regret. In the garden at Hawthorne Manor the day before her wedding, when she'd stood so close he could smell the lavender in her hair, and all he'd wanted was to pull her into his arms and run. And now, he asked quietly. Rose's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Now I'm wondering if it's worse to have it, and know it can't last, or to never have it at all. Arthur stood abruptly, unable to stay still any longer. He paced to the far side of the small cottage, his hands raking through his hair. It doesn't have to end, he said, his back to her. Arthur, I mean it. He turned to face her, his gaze steady despite the storm raging inside him. Whatever you decide, whether you go back to Greymore or not, this doesn't have to end. Not unless you want it to. Rose stood slowly, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She wore only his shirt now, the fabric hanging loose on her frame, the sleeves rolled up to keep from dragging on the floor. "What are you saying?" Arthur took a step toward her, then another. He stopped just out of reach, his hands clenched at his sides as if fighting the urge to touch her. "I'm saying I don't care anymore," he said, his voice rough. "About what's proper, about what society expects. About the rules I've spent my whole life following." He took another step closer. "I care about you. I've cared about you since the first time I saw you at that ridiculous garden party when you told Lord Pemberton his opinions on literature were charmingly outdated." Rose's eyes widened. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." Arthur's voice dropped lower. "I remember the way you laughed when you thought no one was listening. I remember the way you bit your lip when you were nervous. I remember the exact shade of green your eyes turned when you were angry. I remember the sound of your voice when you said my name." Rose's breath caught. "I remember standing in that church and watching you marry someone else," Arthur continued, his composure cracking. "And I remember telling myself it was the right thing to do, the honorable thing, that letting you go was what a gentleman would do." He laughed, bitter and sharp. "I have regretted it every single day since." The space between them felt charged, electric, dangerous. Rose closed the distance. Her hands came up to grip the front of his shirt, her eyes searching his face. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because it makes it harder." "Good." Arthur's voice was firm. "It should be hard, it should hurt, because if it doesn't, it means we're not fighting for something that matters." Rose stared up at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "And what if fighting isn't enough? What if I leave him and you lose everything? Your title, your reputation, your family?" "I don't care." "Arthur, I don't care, Rose." He said it louder this time, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I have spent 32 years being a duke. I have done everything expected of me. I have attended every pointless social event, smiled at every ambitious mother, entertained every proposal for alliances I didn't want. I have been dutiful, respectable, empty." His forehead dropped to hers, his eyes closing. "And the one time I wanted something for myself, I let it go because it was the right thing to do." His hands tightened on her face. "I let you go," he whispered hoarsely. "I stood in that church and watched you marry a man I knew would never deserve you. I told myself it was noble, that it was what honor demanded, and I have regretted it every single day since." Rose's hands came up to cover his, her own eyes filling with tears. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to be the Countess of Greymore. I don't want to smile through another dinner or sleep in another cold bed or wake up one more morning wondering if this is all my life will ever be." Her fingers tightened around his wrists. "I want to be with you. I have always wanted to be with you, and I don't care if it ruins me. I don't care if I lose everything, because losing you again would be worse." Something in Arthur's chest cracked wide open. The control he'd maintained for years, the careful distance, the practiced restraint, shattered completely. He kissed her. Not gently, not tentatively. He kissed her like a man who'd been drowning for 2 years and had finally found air. Rose made a sound against his mouth, half sob, half surrender, and her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, closer, until there was no space left between them. The kiss deepened. Arthur's hands slid from her face to her hair, tangling in the loose strands. Rose's arms wound around his neck and she rose on her toes, pressing herself against him. It was desperate. It was inevitable. It was 2 years of longing and grief and impossible love finally breaking free. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. Arthur's forehead rested against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't take that back," Rose whispered against his lips. "I don't want to," Arthur said. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes searching his. "What do we do now?" Arthur's hands came up to cup her face again, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "We leave," he said. "We leave England, if we have to. We go somewhere no one knows us, somewhere you can be free." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but this time there was no sadness in them, only relief, only hope. "You would do that?" she asked. Arthur's answer was immediate, absolute. "I would do anything." And he meant it. Rose kissed him again, slower this time, sweeter, filled with gratitude and wonder and the fragile beginning of joy. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thunder of his heartbeat. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. "So am I." She looked up at him, surprised. Arthur managed a faint smile. "I've never done this before. Run away. Defied everything I was raised to uphold. I don't know what comes next. But I do know I'd rather face all of that with you than spend another day pretending I don't love you." Rose's breath hitched. "Say it again," she whispered. "I love you." Her eyes closed, fresh tears spilling over. "Again. I love you, Rose." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I have loved you for years, and I will love you for the rest of my life." She buried her face in his chest, her arms wrapping around his waist. "I love you too," she said, her voice muffled but clear. "I have always loved you." And there, in a forgotten cottage with the storm finally quiet outside, two people who had spent years denying themselves finally stopped fighting. They couldn't leave immediately. The snow was still too deep, the roads impassable. But the decision had been made, and with it came a strange sense of clarity. Arthur and Rose spent the rest of the day preparing, not just for the journey ahead, but for the life they were about to step into. A life without titles, without protection, without anything except each other. Arthur rationed what little food they had. Rose mended her torn cloak as best she could, her fingers clumsy with cold but steady with purpose. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The silence between them had shifted, no longer heavy with unsaid things, but filled with the quiet understanding of two people who had finally chosen each other. As evening fell and the fire burned low again, Rose sat beside Arthur, her head resting on his shoulder. His arm was around her, his hand tracing absent patterns on her sleeve. "Do you think they'll come looking for me?" she asked. Arthur considered the question. "Eventually, but not soon. If your husband is in London and the servants are too afraid to act, it will be days before anyone realizes you're truly gone. And when they do, they'll assume you died in the storm." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "Or that you ran away with a lover." Rose lifted her head to look at him. "Which is the truth?" Arthur's lips quirked into the faintest smile. "Which is the truth?" She settled back against him. "My family will never forgive me. I know. Society will call me a scandal, a disgrace. I know. And you," her voice faltered, "you'll lose your reputation, your standing, everything you've built." Arthur's arm tightened around her. "Rose, I've spent my entire life being what everyone else wanted me to be. The perfect duke, the perfect heir, the perfect example of restraint and duty, and it has made me miserable." He tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. "If losing all of that is the price of having you, I'll pay it gladly." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they didn't fall. She blinked them back and kissed him, soft, slow, a promise rather than a plea. When she pulled away, her voice was steady. "Then let's pay it together." The next morning, the storm had passed completely. Arthur ventured outside first, checking the state of the roads. The snow had begun to melt in places, enough that a horse could navigate carefully. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. When he returned to the cottage, Rose was dressed in her dried gown, her cloak fastened, her hair pinned back as neatly as she could manage without a mirror. She looked fragile still, pale, too thin, but there was steel in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "We're leaving?" she asked. Arthur nodded. "We'll head east. Avoid the main roads. There's a port town 2 days' ride from here. We can book passage to the continent from there. And after that, wherever you want to go." Rose exhaled slowly, nodding. "All right." Arthur saddled the horse, securing what little they had. Then he helped Rose mount, settling in behind her, his arms bracketing her as he took the reins. They rode in silence, the frozen landscape stretching out around them like a blank page waiting to be written on. They made it less than 5 miles before they saw the riders. Arthur spotted them first, 3 figures on horseback, dark shapes against the white horizon, moving fast. His jaw tightened. "Hold on," he murmured to Rose, urging the horse into a faster pace. But it was too late. The riders had seen them. Within minutes they were surrounded. Arthur pulled the horse to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to shield Rose. The 3 men circled them, their faces hard. their expressions unreadable beneath heavy cloaks. The lead rider dismounted. He was older, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the left side of his face. "Your Grace," the man said, his tone neutral. Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Captain Hendricks." Rose stiffened. She recognized the name. Hendricks was one of Greymore's men, a former military captain turned enforcer for the Earl's estate. Hendricks' gaze flicked to Rose. "Countess." "Your husband has been informed of your disappearance." Arthur's grip on the reins tightened. "Has he?" "He has, and he's requested your immediate return." Rose's voice was quiet, but firm. "I'm not going back." Hendricks' expression didn't change. "With respect, my lady, that's not your decision to make." Arthur's voice turned ice cold. "It's entirely her decision." Hendricks finally looked at him properly. His eyes were calculating, measuring. "Your Grace," he said slowly, "I understand your concern, but Lady Greymore is a married woman. Whatever arrangement you and she may have come to, it holds no legal weight. The law is clear." "I don't care about legality." Hendricks' eyebrows rose. "Then you're a fool." "Perhaps." Arthur's jaw clenched. "But I'm a fool who won't let you take her." Hendricks studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "The Earl suspected, you know," he said quietly. "Even before the wedding. He knew you looked at her differently." Arthur's expression didn't change, but Rose felt him tense behind her. "Then he should have let her go," Arthur said. "Let her go?" Hendricks laughed, cold and sharp. "Your Grace, men like Greymore don't let go of their possessions. They destroy them before they allow that." Rose's breath caught audibly. Arthur's free hand moved to his riding crop. Not a weapon, but close enough. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning." Hendricks remounted his horse. "The Earl will destroy you for this. You, your family, your name. He has the resources and the connections to bury you. And he will." Arthur's jaw clenched. He knew Hendricks was right. Greymore was a powerful man, vindictive and cruel. If he wanted to ruin Arthur, he could. Easily. But Arthur didn't move. "Let him try," he said. Hendricks stared at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been respect. "Very well," he said. "I'll deliver your refusal to the Earl." He turned his horse. "But know this, Your Grace, you've just started a war you can't win." He paused, then added more quietly, "I hope she's worth it." Arthur's answer was immediate. "She is." Hendricks nodded once. Then he and his men rode off, disappearing back into the white expanse. The silence that followed was deafening. Rose was trembling. Arthur could feel it, the way her body shook against his. "Arthur," she whispered, "he's going to come after us. I know. He'll ruin you. I know. We should... No." Arthur's voice was firm. "We're not turning back. Not now. Not ever." He urged the horse forward again, his arms tight around Rose, his heart pounding. The war had begun, and Arthur Worthington, Duke of Ashbourne, had never been more certain of anything in his life. They reached the port town of Harwich just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fading gold. The town was small, unremarkable, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a harbour filled with ships, rocking gently in the tide. The air smelled of salt and fish and tar. Sailors shouted to one another in rough voices. Merchants haggled over crates. No one paid attention to a duke and a countess travelling without servants, without baggage, without anything that marked them as nobility. Here they were just two more travellers, anonymous, invisible. It was the first time in Arthur's life he'd ever felt free. He secured a room at a modest inn near the docks. Nothing grand, just a small space with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a window overlooking the harbour. The innkeeper asked no questions. Arthur paid in coin, not credit, and that was enough. Rose sank onto the edge of the bed the moment the door closed behind them. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her hands still trembling slightly from the cold and the adrenaline that hadn't yet left her system. Arthur knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Rose nodded, though her eyes told a different story. "I keep thinking he's going to appear, that Hendricks will come back with more men, that this is all going to fall apart. It won't. You don't know that. I do." Arthur's grip tightened. "Because I won't let it." Rose's breath hitched. She looked down at their joined hands, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "So am I." She looked up, surprised. Arthur managed a faint smile. "I've never done this before. Run away. Defied everything I was raised to uphold. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if we'll make it to the continent without being caught. I don't know if we'll have enough money to survive once we get there." He paused. "But I do know I'd rather face all of that with you than spend another day pretending I don't love you." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but this time she was smiling. "You're a terrible duke," she whispered. Arthur's smile widened. "I know." She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and slow, and for a moment the fear melted away. That night, they didn't sleep. Not because of passion, though the tension between them was palpable, alive and electric, but because there was too much to say. Too much they'd held back for too long. They sat by the small window, wrapped in blankets, watching the ships sway in the harbor. Arthur told her about the years since her marriage, the endless social obligations, the loneliness, the way he'd thrown himself into managing his estates just to avoid thinking about her. "I stopped attending balls," he admitted. "I couldn't bear the thought of seeing you there with him. So I made excuses. Estate business, parliamentary duties. Anything to avoid it." Rose's hand found his beneath the blanket. "I looked for you," she said quietly. "Every time. Even though I knew you wouldn't be there, I still looked." Arthur's throat tightened. "Rose, he knew," she interrupted. "Graymore. He knew that I cared for you. He never said it directly, but there were comments. Little cruelties. He would mention your name just to watch me flinch." Arthur's jaw clenched. "Why didn't you—" "What could I have done?" Rose's voice was bitter. "Write to you? Beg you to rescue me? I made my choice, Arthur. I married him. I had to live with it. It wasn't a choice if you had no other option." Rose looked at him, her eyes shimmering in the lamplight. "My father was drowning in debt. Graymore offered to clear it all in exchange for my hand. What was I supposed to do? Let my family lose everything?" "You were supposed to come to me," Arthur said fiercely. "I would have—" "What? Married me out of pity?" Rose shook her head. "You were being courted by every eligible woman in London. The Duke of Ashbourne could have had anyone. Why would you have chosen the daughter of a bankrupt baron?" Arthur stared at her, incredulous. "Because I loved you, you stubborn woman. I have always loved you." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Rose's breath caught. "You never said—" "How could I?" Arthur's voice cracked. "You were promised to someone else. Saying it would only have made it harder." "It couldn't have been harder," Rose whispered. "Marrying him was the hardest thing I've ever done. Walking away from you was—" Her voice broke. "It broke me, Arthur. Every day since has been trying to live with that break." Arthur pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She fit there perfectly, like she always had. "Then we won't break again," he murmured into her hair. "Whatever comes next, we face it whole. Together." Rose tilted her head back to look at him. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't regret this, that in a year or 5 years or 20, you won't look at me and wish you'd stayed in England." Arthur cupped her face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. "I promise," he said. "On my life, Rose, on everything I am and everything I'll ever be, I will never regret choosing you." And then he kissed her, slow and deep, pouring every ounce of certainty he possessed into the press of his lips against hers. When they finally broke apart, Rose was crying, but she was smiling too. "All right," she whispered. "All right? All right. Let's figure it out. Let's build something new." Arthur's relief was so profound it made him dizzy. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed. They stayed awake until dawn, talking, planning, dreaming of a life they could barely imagine but desperately wanted. And when the first light touched the harbor, turning the water to liquid gold, they fell asleep in each other's arms, exhausted, terrified, and more hopeful than either had been in years. The next morning, Arthur arranged their passage. A merchant vessel bound for Calais was leaving with the evening tide. The captain was a grizzled Scotsman who asked no questions and accepted Arthur's coin with a nod. 2 passengers, Arthur said, discreet. The captain grunted. "I've carried worse." Arthur didn't doubt it. He returned to the inn to find Rose standing by the window, staring out at the harbor. She didn't turn when he entered. "It's done," Arthur said. "We leave tonight." Rose nodded slowly. "And after that?" "France first, then Italy maybe, or further east, wherever you want." She finally turned to look at him. "And your estates, your title, your responsibilities?" Arthur crossed the room to her. "I'll arrange for a steward to manage Ashbourne. The title will pass to my cousin eventually. The estates will survive without me. And your family? They'll be furious." His tone was matter-of-fact. "They'll disown me, most likely. But they'll survive too." Rose's expression was pained. "Arthur, I can't ask you to give up everything." "You're not asking." Arthur's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." Rose closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. "I don't deserve you." "You do." He pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." They left Harwich as the sun set, the harbour fading into shadow behind them. The merchant ship cut through the dark water, its sails billowing in the wind. Arthur and Rose stood at the rail, watching England disappear into the distance. Rose's hand found his. "No going back now," she whispered. Arthur laced his fingers through hers. "No going back," he agreed. But as he said it, Rose suddenly swayed. Her face went pale and she gripped the rail tightly. "Rose?" "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just the motion of the ship." Within minutes, she wasn't fine. Arthur spent the rest of the night below deck with her, holding her hair back when she was sick, bringing her water, whispering reassurances that didn't quite mask his own helplessness. "I'm sorry," she said for the third time, her voice weak. "Stop apologizing," Arthur replied, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "You shouldn't have to." "Rose," he cut her off gently. "If you think this is the worst thing I'll ever do for you, you're underestimating me." Despite everything, she smiled. And as the stars began to appear overhead through the porthole, cold and distant and impossibly bright, Arthur realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. The voyage to Calais took 2 days. 2 days of salt-thick air and creaking wood and the endless rhythmic roll of the sea. Arthur had never been fond of sailing. His world was one of solid ground, estates anchored to centuries of history. But here, suspended between one life and another, he found a strange kind of peace. By the second day, Rose had found her sea legs. They stood on deck together, wrapped in cloaks against the wind, watching the French coast emerge from the mist like a promise. "I've never been to France," Rose said quietly. "Neither have I, not properly." She glanced at him. "What do you mean, not properly?" "I passed through Paris once, years ago, on a tour with my father. We stayed 3 days, attended a few dinners and left. It was all very à la propre." He said the word with faint distaste. Rose's lips curved. "And now?" "Now?" Arthur looked out at the approaching shore. "Now I have no idea what we're walking into. And I find I don't mind." Rose leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "I think I like this version of you." "Which version?" "The one who doesn't have all the answers." Arthur huffed a quiet laugh. "Careful what you wish for." They docked in Calais just after noon. The port was chaotic, a tangle of languages, merchants shouting over each other, sailors unloading cargo with practiced efficiency. Arthur kept Rose close, one hand on her elbow, guiding her through the crowd. They found lodging at a small boarding house near the center of town. The proprietress was a sturdy woman with sharp eyes and little patience for nonsense, but she accepted Arthur's French without comment and showed them to a clean, sparsely furnished room. "How long you staying?" she asked in accented English. "A few days," Arthur replied. "Maybe longer." The woman shrugged. "Pay in advance." He did. When the door closed behind her, Rose sank into the single chair by the window, exhaling heavily. "We're really here," she said. Arthur set their meager belongings down. "We are." "What now?" It was the question they'd been avoiding. What now? They'd run. They'd escaped. But running only worked if you had somewhere to run to. Arthur pulled the other chair over and sat across from her. "Now we decide where we want to go," he said. "Italy, like I mentioned, or further, Vienna, perhaps. Somewhere we can disappear for a while." Rose frowned. "And then?" "And then we live." She searched his face. It can't be that simple. Why not? Because, she broke off, frustrated. Because we're not simple people, Arthur. You're a duke. I'm a married woman. We can't just vanish. We already have. For now. But eventually Greymore will petition for a divorce, Arthur said calmly. Or he won't. Either way, it doesn't change what we're doing. Rose's hands twisted in her lap. And if he does? If he drags both our names through every paper in England? Then we'll be ruined in England. Arthur leaned forward. Rose, I know what we're risking. I know what we're giving up. But I also know I can't go back. Not to that life. Not without you. Her eyes shone. You say that now. I'll say it every day for the rest of my life if that's what it takes for you to believe me. Rose stood abruptly, pacing to the window. I'm terrified, she admitted, of what happens next. Of what we've done, of being happy. Arthur rose, crossing to her. Why does being happy terrify you? She turned to face him, her expression raw. Because I don't know how to do it. I've spent so long being what everyone else needed me to be. The dutiful daughter, the obedient wife. I don't know who I am without those things. Arthur's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Then we'll figure it out, he said. Together. Rose closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Promise me, she whispered. Anything. Promise me you won't regret this. That in a year, or 5 years, or 20, you won't look at me and wish you'd stayed in England. Arthur's heart clenched. He tilted her face up until she opened her eyes. I promise, he said. On my life, Rose. I will never regret choosing you. And then he kissed her, slow and deliberate, pouring every ounce of certainty he possessed into the press of his lips against hers. When they finally broke apart, Rose was crying, but she was smiling too. All right, she whispered. All right? All right. Let's figure it out. They stayed in Calais for a week, not because they needed to, but because Rose asked for time. Time to breathe. Time to adjust to the impossible reality of what they'd done. Arthur didn't push. He spent the days walking the narrow streets of the port town, arranging travel documents, exchanging what coin he had for French currency. Rose spent most of her time in their room, writing. She didn't tell him what she was writing at first, but on the 5th day she handed him a sealed letter. I need you to send this, she said. Arthur turned the envelope over. It was addressed to her sister. He looked up at her. Are you sure? Rose nodded. She deserves to know I'm alive, that I'm all right. What did you tell her? The truth. Rose's voice was steady. That I left. That I'm not coming back. That I'm sorry. Arthur studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll send it. He went to the post office that afternoon and paid for the letter to be sent to England. He didn't know if it would reach her sister, didn't know if it would be intercepted by Greymore first, but he sent it anyway, because Rose had asked. 3 days later, they left Calais. They travelled south toward Paris, moving slowly through the French countryside. The landscape was beautiful in a way England never was. Rolling hills, vineyards heavy with spring growth, small villages that seemed untouched by time. Rose began to relax. Arthur saw it in the way she held herself, the way her smiles came a little easier. She still flinched at sudden noises, still looked over her shoulder more than she should. But gradually, the fear began to fade. They stayed in small inns, ate simple meals, spoke to no one who didn't need to be spoken to. Arthur used a false name, Mr. Harding, and introduced Rose as his wife. She didn't correct him. Paris loomed on the horizon after a week of travel. Arthur had arranged for them to stay in a modest apartment in the Marais district, far from the grand hotels where English nobility might recognize him. The space was small but comfortable, a sitting room, a bedroom, a tiny kitchen. Rose stood in the center of the sitting room, turning slowly, taking it all in. It's ours? She asked. For as long as we want it. She looked at him, something fragile and hopeful flickering in her eyes. I've never had something that was just mine. Arthur crossed to her, taking her hands. Now you do. They settled into a rhythm. Mornings were quiet. Arthur would wake first, make tea, bring it to Rose still half asleep in bed. She'd smile at him, drowsy and warm, and he'd kiss her forehead before retreating to let her wake properly. Afternoons were for exploring. They walked the streets of Paris like tourists, marveling at the architecture, the art, the sheer life of the city. No one knew them here, no one cared. One afternoon they found themselves in a bustling market. Vendors hawked vegetables, bread, cheese, flowers. The smell of fresh bread mingled with herbs and earth. "You've never bought vegetables before, have you?" Rose asked, trying not to laugh as Arthur examined a strange root. Arthur held it up. "What even is this?" "A turnip. And people eat this?" Rose burst into laughter, the kind that came from deep in her chest, unrestrained and bright. Arthur stared at her, the turnip forgotten. "What?" she asked, still smiling. "Nothing," he said softly. I've never seen you laugh like that." Rose's smile softened. "I've never had a reason to." Arthur set the turnip down and pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the market, with vendors shouting and strangers brushing past. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life giving you reasons," he murmured into her hair. Evenings were theirs. They'd return to the apartment, cook simple meals together, Rose teaching Arthur how to prepare things he'd never touched in his life, both of them laughing when he inevitably did something wrong. They'd sit by the window and watch the city lights flicker on one by one, talking about everything and nothing. And at night, they learned each other. Not just physically, though there was that too, slow and tentative at first, then deeper, more certain as the days passed. But in every other way, the way Rose's eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way Arthur's carefully constructed walls crumbled when she touched him, the way they fit together, two broken pieces, finally made whole. One night, as they lay tangled together in the dark, Rose spoke softly. "Do you ever think about going back?" Arthur's fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "No. Not even a little. Not even a little." She was quiet for a moment. "I do. Sometimes. Not because I want to, but because it's hard to believe this is real." Arthur pressed a kiss to her hair. "It's real. How do you know?" "Because I've never felt anything more real in my life." Rose turned in his arms, her eyes searching his in the dim light. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud since the cottage. Arthur's chest tightened. His hand came up to cup her cheek. "I love you too," he said. "I have for years, and I will for all the years to come." Rose's breath hitched. She kissed him then, slow and deep, and for the rest of the night, neither of them spoke. Autumn turned to winter in Paris. The city transformed under frost and early snow, the Seine turning grey and sluggish, the cafes filling with people seeking warmth. Arthur and Rose had been in France for 4 months now, and the novelty of freedom had begun to settle into something deeper, something like a life. But it wasn't easy. Money was tighter than Arthur had anticipated. The funds he'd brought from England were dwindling faster than he'd hoped. He'd found work translating documents for a solicitor who didn't ask questions, but the pay was modest. Rose had begun teaching English to the children of a wealthy merchant family, but even together, their income barely covered rent and food. Arthur had never worried about money before. As a duke, wealth had simply existed. Now counting coins and calculating expenses felt foreign, humbling. One particularly cold evening in early December, Rose came home to find Arthur sitting at the small table, his head in his hands. "Arthur?" He looked up. His expression was strained. "What is it?" Rose asked, setting down her basket. Arthur gestured to the papers spread before him. "We need to make a decision." Rose sat across from him. "What kind of decision?" "The rent is increasing in January, and our funds are—" He trailed off. "We can't stay here much longer. Not unless we find additional income." Rose studied him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. His father's pocket watch. Rose's eyes widened. "Arthur, no, it's worth enough to keep us comfortable for several months," he said quietly. "Maybe longer if we're careful." "But it's—" Rose's voice cracked. "It's your father's. It's all you have left of him." Arthur looked down at the watch, his thumb brushing over the engraved surface. "My father cared about legacy," he said, "about the family name, about duty above all else." He looked up at Rose. "But he never taught me what it meant to be happy. He never showed me what it looked like to choose love over obligation." He set the watch on the table between them. This watch represents everything I used to be, everything I was supposed to become. His voice was steady. But I don't need it anymore, because I already have everything that matters. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Arthur, I'm selling it, he said firmly, and we're using the money to start fresh. Properly this time. Rose reached across the table, her hand covering his. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Arthur sold the watch 3 days later. The amount he received was substantial, enough to ease the immediate pressure and allow them to plan for the future. But more than that, it felt like severing the last tie to his old life. He came home to find Rose preparing dinner, a simple stew, but made with care. It's done, he said. Rose turned from the stove. She searched his face for regret and found none. How do you feel? She asked. Arthur crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. Free, he said simply. Christmas came quietly. They had no family, no grand celebrations, no elaborate gifts. But on Christmas morning, Rose woke to find Arthur had somehow procured fresh oranges, a luxury they couldn't afford, and had arranged them in a small bowl by the window. Arthur, she breathed, how did you— Don't ask questions, he said, smiling. Just enjoy them. They ate the oranges slowly, savoring each segment, laughing at the absurdity of it all. A duke and a countess, reduced to celebrating with fruit. It should have felt sad. Instead, it felt perfect. That evening, as snow began to fall outside their window, Rose sat curled against Arthur's chest. I've been thinking, she said quietly. About? About leaving Paris, about going somewhere warmer, somewhere we can breathe. Arthur's hand stilled in her hair. Where were you thinking? Italy, Rose said. I've heard it's beautiful, and warmer, and far enough from England that we'd truly be starting over. Arthur considered this. It would mean leaving what little we've built here. I know, but what we've built is each other. We can take that anywhere. Arthur pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Then Italy it is. But before they could make plans, doubt crept in. It happened late one night, a week after Christmas. Rose couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Arthur woke to find her sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, her face troubled. Rose? He sat up. What's wrong? She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. Have I ruined your life? Arthur's heart clenched. What? Have I ruined your life? She repeated, turning to look at him. Be honest. You gave up everything for me. Your title, your estates, your family, your future. And for what? To live in a tiny apartment, struggling to make ends meet, with a woman who isn't even legally yours? Arthur crossed to her, kneeling in front of her chair. Look at me, he said. She did, reluctantly. You have not ruined my life, he said firmly. You have given me a life, there's a difference. But, Rose, before you I was existing, playing a role, being what everyone expected. I was miserable, empty. I had everything society said I should want and nothing I actually needed. He took her hands. You didn't ruin me, you saved me. Rose's breath hitched. You're just saying that— I'm not. His voice was fierce now. I mean every word. I would rather live in this apartment with you, counting coins and eating simple meals, than spend one more day in Ashbourne Hall without you. Do you understand? Tears spilled down her cheeks. I'm just so afraid you'll wake up one day and realize you made a mistake. Arthur stood, pulling her up with him. He cupped her face in his hands. Then I'll spend every day making sure you never doubt again, he said. I love you, Rose, not because you're convenient, not because I feel obligated, but because you are the only person who has ever made me feel like myself. He kissed her then, gentle, reverent, filled with everything he couldn't put into words. When he pulled back, Rose was still crying, but she was also smiling. Italy, she whispered. Italy, Arthur agreed. Together. Always together. Spring arrived, and with it, a letter that changed everything. Arthur and Rose had been preparing for their move to Italy, selling what little they had, arranging passage, dreaming of vineyards and sunshine. Then the letter arrived. It was from a solicitor in London. Arthur opened it with trepidation. Rose watched from across the room, her hands twisting nervously. He read in silence. His expression didn't change, but Rose saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the paper. "What is it?" she asked. Arthur looked up. "Greymore has filed for divorce." The words hung in the air. Rose's face went pale. "On what grounds?" "Abandonment. Adultery." Arthur's jaw tightened. "He's named me specifically." Rose's breath left her in a rush. She sank into a chair. "Then it's done. My reputation is destroyed," Arthur finished quietly. "According to this, every newspaper in London has run the story. You've been publicly disowned by your family." He paused, then added, "And I've been stripped of my title and estates by order of the Court of Chancery." The silence that followed was absolute. Rose looked up at him, horror and guilt warring in her expression. "Arthur, I'm so sorry. I'm so—" Arthur crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her to her feet. "Don't," he said firmly. "Don't you dare apologize." "But you've lost everything." "I lost a title," he corrected. "I lost estates I never wanted. I lost a life that was never really mine." He cupped her face in his hands. "But I didn't lose you, and that's the only thing that matters." Rose's tears spilled over. "How can you say that?" "Because it's true." His voice was steady, certain. "I would rather be here, in this apartment with you, than anywhere else in the world." Rose shook her head, but Arthur continued. "Every choice has a cost, Rose, and I knew what this would cost, but I also knew what it would gain me. You. A life lived on my own terms. The freedom to love who I want without permission or pretense." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't regret it," he whispered. "Not for a second." Rose's arms came up around his neck, holding him tight. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the world they'd known crumbled completely, and the world they were building stood firm. 3 months later, in a small chapel on the outskirts of Paris, Arthur Worthington, no longer a duke, no longer bound by the rules of a world that had never fit him, married Rose. There were no guests. No grand ceremony, just the 2 of them, a sympathetic priest and vows spoken in quiet, certain voices. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Arthur kissed Rose like it was the first time and the last time and every time in between. And when they stepped out into the sunlight hand in hand, they didn't look back. 5 years later, Tuscany, Italy. The villa sat on a hillside overlooking the Italian countryside, its walls the color of faded terracotta, its garden wild with lavender and rosemary. Arthur stood on the terrace, watching the sun set over the vineyards. Behind him he heard the sound of laughter, Rose's voice bright and unguarded in a way it had never been in England. He turned to find her in the doorway, flour dusting her hands, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She was smiling. "Dinner's nearly ready," she said, "though I can't promise it's edible." Arthur crossed to her, pulling her into his arms despite her protests about the flour. "I'm sure it's perfect," he murmured against her hair. Rose laughed. "You say that every time, and every time you're wrong. And yet I'm still here." She pulled back to look at him, her expression softening. "Yes, you are." They'd been in Italy for 3 years now. After Paris, they'd drifted south, following the sun and their own restless need to keep moving. They'd lived in Florence for a year, then Rome. Finally, they'd found this place, a crumbling villa no one wanted, in a region where no one knew their names or cared about English scandals. Arthur had used what little money he had left to buy it. They'd spent months repairing it themselves, mending walls, fixing the roof, coaxing the garden back to life. It wasn't grand. It would never be Ashbourne Hall, but it was theirs. Rose had started painting, landscapes mostly, sold at a small gallery in the nearby town. Arthur wrote essays, translations, the occasional piece for French and Italian journals. They didn't make much money, but they made enough, and they were happy. That night after dinner, they sat on the terrace under a sky thick with stars. Rose leaned against Arthur's shoulder, her hand resting on his chest. "Do you ever think about England?" she asked. Arthur considered the question. "Sometimes I wonder how Ashbourne is doing, if my cousin is managing the estates well, if my mother ever forgave me." He paused. "But regret? No, never." Rose tilted her head to look up at him. "Even after everything you lost?" "I didn't lose anything that mattered," Arthur said. "I traded things I never wanted for the one thing I always did." He looked down at her. his eyes warm. You. Rose's breath caught. Then she smiled, that brilliant, unguarded smile that still made his heart stutter. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Arthur's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Rose took his hand and placed it on her stomach. For a moment, Arthur didn't understand. Then realization dawned, slow and breathtaking. "You're—" Rose nodded, her smile tremulous. "I'm pregnant." Arthur's breath left him in a rush. His hand spread wider, as if he could feel the impossible truth of it through her dress. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice rough. "A few weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Arthur looked up at her, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "We're going to have a child," he said, as if testing the words. "We are." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she laughed. "Arthur, I can't breathe." "I don't care," he said, though he loosened his grip slightly. When he pulled back, his hands were shaking. "Rose. God. He couldn't finish. The words weren't enough. So instead he kissed her. Her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. He kissed her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. When he finally pulled back, Rose was crying. "We're going to be all right," she whispered. "Aren't we?" Arthur cupped her face in his hands. "We already are," he said. 6 months later. The baby was born on a cold December morning as the first snow of winter fell on the Tuscan hills. A girl. Tiny, perfect, with Rose's dark hair and Arthur's eyes. Arthur held her for the first time with shaking hands, terrified he might break her. But Rose just smiled, exhausted and radiant, and told him he was doing fine. They named her Eleanor, not after anyone in particular, just because it was beautiful, because it was theirs to choose. 10 years later, the garden was full of laughter. Eleanor, 10 years old now, wild-haired and fearless, was chasing her younger brother through the rows of lavender. Thomas, 6, shrieked with delight as he ducked behind a rosemary bush. Rose stood on the terrace, watching them with a smile that hadn't faded in 15 years. Arthur came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "They're going to destroy the garden," Rose said, though there was no real concern in her voice. "They'll rebuild it," Arthur replied. "We always do." Rose turned in his arms, looking up at him. There were lines at the corners of her eyes now, silver threads in her hair. But to Arthur, she was exactly as she'd been that night in the cottage. Beautiful, brave, utterly irreplaceable. "Do you know what day it is?" she asked. Arthur frowned. "Should I?" Rose's smile widened. 15 years ago today, you found me in the snow." Arthur's expression softened. "Has it really been that long?" "It has." He pulled her closer. "Best decision I ever made." Rose laughed. "You say that like you planned it." "I didn't plan it," Arthur admitted. "But I'd do it again, every time, in every lifetime." Rose's eyes shimmered, even knowing what it would cost. Especially knowing what it would cost. Arthur's voice was steady. "Because what I gained was worth infinitely more." Rose kissed him then, soft and sweet, the way she had 1,000 times before and would 1,000 times again. And in the garden, their children laughed. And in the villa on the hillside, 2 people who had once been a duke and a countess, who had once been trapped by titles and duty and the weight of other people's expectations, lived a life that was wholly, completely, impossibly their own. The letter that came too late. 20 years after Arthur and Rose disappeared into the winter storm, a letter arrived at the villa in Tuscany. It was addressed to Arthur Worthington, formerly Duke of Ashbourne. Arthur opened it with curiosity. He rarely received correspondence from England anymore. Inside was a brief note from a solicitor. His cousin, the man who had inherited the Ashbourne title, had died. There were no heirs. By law, the title and estates were to revert to Arthur, if he chose to claim them. Arthur read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on his desk. Rose found him there an hour later, staring out the window at the vineyards. "What is it?" she asked. Arthur handed her the letter. Rose read it in silence. When she finished, she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Arthur didn't hesitate. "Nothing," he said. Rose's eyes widened. "Arthur, I don't want it, Rose." His voice was calm. "Certain?" I stopped being the Duke of Ashbourne the night I chose you. I'm not going back to that, not for anything. Rose set the letter down. But the estates, the legacy, your children, don't need it. Arthur turned to face her fully. Eleanor is studying art in Florence. Thomas is apprenticing with a winemaker. They're happy. They're free. Why would I take that away from them by dragging them back to England and a life they never asked for? Rose stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. You're sure? She asked. Arthur crossed to her, taking her hands in his. I have never been more sure of anything in my life, he said. Rose leaned up and kissed him. Then burn it, she whispered. Arthur did. He took the letter, walked to the fireplace and tossed it into the flames. And as the paper curled and blackened and turned to ash, Arthur Worthington, who had once been a duke and was now simply a man who loved his wife, walked away without looking back. Because some choices once made didn't need to be reconsidered. Some loves once claimed were worth everything. And some lives, once built from nothing but hope and courage and the willingness to walk into the storm, were too precious to ever trade away.
Couldn't keep every promise ever told was a vow I learned to bleed. I wore silence like a crown, learned to smile, learned to stay. But my heart was burning down every night, every day. Then you found me in the storm when I'd given up the fight. You didn't save me from the dark, you stayed with me inside. I would choose you again, even knowing the cost. Even if I lose the world and everything I lost, I would choose you again, through the fire, through the end. If I had 1,000 lives, I'd still choose you again. We left names behind in snow, left the echoes, left the past, built a life we didn't know, but it felt like home at last. No more titles, no disguise, just your hand holding mine. In your eyes I recognized a love that outlived time. They called it ruin, called it shame, but we called it being free. And every scar became our proof of who we chose to be. I would choose you again when the world turns away, when the nights feel too long and the light starts to fade. I would choose you again when the fear comes back in. If love asks for everything, I'd give it all again. Years will pass, our hair will change, children laughing in the yard. Every wrinkle, every name is a map of how we loved. And if someday I look back at the road we didn't take, I won't mourn what we left behind. Only thank God we were brave. I would choose you again, in the silence, in the flame. When the world forgets our names, I will still say yours the same. I would choose you again, not for glory, not for gain, just for this simple truth that loving you was never in vain. So let the past turn into dust, let the old world disappear. I found forever in your arms, and I